Hello and welcome to Wisdom Talks, the podcast accompanying the Metis Project, the internet portal for intercultural wisdom literature and wisdom practices, to be found on www.metis.ethz.ch. My name is Eliane Schmid, and I will be hosting today's conversation centered on the question, what is the meaning of life? Russian author Leo Tolstoy pondered this question in the following way. My question, that which at the age of 50 brought me to the verge of suicide, was the simplest of questions, lying in the soul of every man from the foolish child to the wisest elder. It was a question without an answer to which one cannot live, as I had found my experience. It was, what will come of what I am doing today, or shall do tomorrow? What will come of my whole life? Differently expressed, the question is, why should I live? Why wish for anything or do anything? It can also be expressed thus, is there any meaning in my life that the inevitable death awaiting me does not destroy? These words were taken from Tolstoy's 1882 short autobiographical book, A Confession. In these confessions, Tolstoy relates his midlife existential crisis and his desperate search for the meaning of life, searching for an answer to his question, what will come of what I am doing? And struggling with the evasiveness of such an answer is something we encounter through centuries of Western philosophy. Tolstoy, celebrated as one of the greatest authors till today, was born into a wealthy family and led a very comfortable life. This wealth that was bestowed on him, which he was simply lucky enough to enjoy, gradually became more and more questionable to him. He grappled with the injustice of a system that perpetuated the divide between the wealthy and the impoverished. Tolstoy was rich, educated, and a successful writer, yet none of this allowed him to understand life. What was it? Why was it? Nothing would reveal to him a positive meaning of life, as he put it. In today's Wisdom Talk, we draw from Tolstoy's existential dilemmas as a foundation for exploring diverse approaches to adopting a positive outlook on life. We juxtapose Tolstoy's inquiries with Viktor Frankl's quest for meaning under drastically different circumstances, enduring total deprivation in a concentration camp. This contrast aims to help us think along different pathways in the search for life's purpose. Guiding us along these pathways is Tobias Esch, general practitioner, neuro and health scientist, professor and head of the Institute of Integrative Healthcare and Health Promotion at the private University of Witten, Herdecke. He's a best-selling author of mental health care books discussing things such as why we should bother getting up in the morning and why we need more of less. Tobias, thank you for joining me in the studio today.
Welcome, thank you.
Tobias, for your work and your books, you have studied the writings of Viktor Frankl. Frankl was a Jewish Austrian neurologist and psychiatrist who survived the horrors of the Third Reich. The Nazis subjected Frankl's pregnant wife to forced abortion. She later died in the concentration camp, and so did his father. His mother and brother were also both murdered in the gas chambers. Despite all this, mental and physical torture inflicted upon him, Frankl managed not to despair completely and clung to life. He then eventually became famous for the phrase, say yes to life. Tobias, could you explain more about Frankl, his life, and how he found a way to regard it as worth living?
Well, you explained the dilemma of Frankl that he then conquered or endured during the concentration camp. So the question actually that became the quest of his life, the man's search for meaning, and how could humanity survive in the face of horror, and even not just survive, but actually grow. This question occurred even before the war and before, as you said, all his loved ones were killed in the concentration camps. He himself being brought to Auschwitz and Dachau and Treblinka, so being the worst places of horror that one can imagine. But the truth is that the question of meaning and the question of the soul had been his topic even before that time. He wrote an essay, The Doctor and the Soul, even before he himself was taken and captured into the concentration camp. So the question was, the doctor with all the profession, the expertise, the techniques, everything given. However, what if the doctor actually is a human being? And that became a topic throughout his life. So the question between the perpetrator, the one who actually is the evil, one could say, and the victim. The dichotomy, the polarity was something that Frankl very early on was questioning, because he said at the end, we all have a soul. He was objecting the idea of guilt as a collective phenomenon. He was interested in responsibility. How could one take responsibility? And what is the responsibility of the individual and the collective? So the quest of his life was not only the search for meaning, but how a soul could thrive and grow into meaning. How could one actually decide as a decision, as a free will decision for meaning, instead of being evil, killing someone? He was interested in this transformation process.
So in a way, he was already, you can never be prepared for something like a concentration camp, of course, but he was mentally already thinking along lines of what happens to people on both sides if they enter such a horrible situation.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, he was born in 1905, so he was a figure of the whole century. He died in 1997. So he covered the whole century, basically, and that includes all those famous people and persons who studied the mind and the psyche, let's say Jung, and of course Freud, who was his colleague. They both were not only psychiatrists, but the German term Nervenarzt. Neurologist doesn't really cover it. It's the doctor for the nerves, or you could say. So they came, like Freud, from the substance of the brain and the nerve cells. And so they had an idea that there's a biological root for the mind and for what one does, because that is the root for motivation and behavior. They both, as Freud, were locating the source of what one does, of behavior, also of thinking in the brain. However, there is a huge difference between Freud and Frankl, and that was already there early on. And Frankl was not getting tired of pointing to that he thought there is no such thing as an ill soul or an ill mind or an ill psyche. So he said the psychologization, I think he would have said in English. So the searching for a sick or ill mind as the reason, and then have to treat that mind to heal the mind, was something that he was opposing almost, because he said the mind is healthy. The mind, he was framing the term Begeisterung in German, which is Geist. It's in Latin, it's spiritus. So inspiration. He was looking for inspiration. What inspires the mind? What are we getting up for in the morning? Why are we going through challenges? And how would that ability, what we could learn from people who are obviously able to cope better and be resilient, how would that be trainable and teachable? So even before the war and everything happened, he was, today we would probably call it positive psychology maybe. That is, not looking at the mind or the soul as something that is ill and should be treated and healed to become like a normal soul, but he was pointing to the fact that there are circumstances and there are potentials and resources in the mind and the psyche that should be addressed, and that the reason should be found within oneself and not in the circumstances that could be as horrific as a concentration camp. But it's within yourself, your soul, where you find this positive source for inspiration, and that would lead to recovery.
And this all sounds, as you said, it's a very positive stance. And it seems like he had a lot of faith in humanity. But then again, World War II started, and you had all these people that were supposed to have a healthy mind and a positive outlook on life, technically, but they did still manage to somehow change perspectives. I don't know if this is the right word, to then become people that did horrible things to other people. Does he ever go along these lines and explain how this comes about, that people can suddenly do these atrocities?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are two aspects I would raise here. Of course, there would be many more in Frankl's opus. However, there are two aspects. So one is the collective. Again, he was denying the idea of collective guilt. He was really harshly opposing that because it's about responsibility. Take your responsibility, but he was not neglecting the idea that you could be in a collective field where people, the potential of the mind, the potential to be inspired would be almost suffocated, would be extracted of a society by pressure, by social pressures, and by the wish to survive. Because basically that's another big topic of his work, is the ability of human and mankind to be a survivor, to be surviving even one's own death. You know, the idea of that I have to die, to incorporate that into a positive meaning. However, if this needs a solid ground to stand on, and this needs a ground that you can trust and rely on something to start with, because he always looked at life or upon life as a trajectory, as a free-floating process that goes through life, or actually he said life comes from the front, from ahead, and goes through you. You are digesting life. You are a producer of your own past. It's a very positive idea of you're constantly producing past, but that needs a certain momentum. This needs a pace. When you get stuck, when you are arrested and cannot move psychologically and physically, that's the danger. When you feel trapped, when you feel loss of control and feel you cannot move, you cannot produce past, you cannot have life go through you and digest it and be producer of past because you get stuck. And that certainly happened in those times when the collective was kind of arrested, thriving, growth, almost not possible, only on the individual level. So that's one thing, the individual had to take the responsibility to still thrive. Frankl frames the idea that it's our responsibility, the free will for meaning, and also the will to transform tragedy into triumph, as he coined it. That needs a stance, and that needs some kind of movement in the mind, in the brain, and in the body, and in the collective body as well. So when the collective body stops moving and to grow, that's one thing. And the other thing, it's really interesting. This is why I love Frankl so much. Because he was almost taking the war and the Shoah and everything that happened to him, he was almost taking it as, well, it happened. Because his ideas were already prepared before that. He was taking himself actually as a proof of concept, himself being in the concentration camp, being a living proof of his concept that he stated even before the Nazi regime. So another thing that he stated even before that times was what he called neurosis. A little bit different from neurosis, as it then was framed by Freud and then became famous. But basically what Frankl framed even before that time and meant with neurosis is what he also called a manager disease. And if you read through the scriptures from Frankl from that time, 90 years old, I was totally stunned and in awe, because what he describes is what we call burnout today. It's exactly the diagnosis. He also called it a disease of time, a time disease. And if you read it, you think, wow, he was so ahead of his times. Today he would be in talk shows and he would be an influencer because he was so modern. Everything that he described actually became a problem for societies many years later. Because what he said is, people don't take time. They're always running. They're always rushing. They're rushing from one to the next. And they need time to reflect. They need time to be with themselves, to realize the three most important things, following Frankl, that man has. First is have a task, have a goal, knowing what you're up for. The second would be finding meaning in what you do, in your task. Like love what you do and feel loved, feel lovable and love people. Don't be hostile towards mankind. And the third then would be obviously, to transform tragedy into triumph. So what happened in the concentration camp and these times is love, where to find love, then how to make meaning in this horror. And the third is, will you survive it? Will you be actually able to triumph? And for many in these times, that kind of thing that you need was out of sight. And so the manager disease, the burnout, became obviously a problem even then because people had no resources left. Yeah.
Now you give me many, many points for many, many questions because this all sounds extremely impressive. So the first one would be still, so he had this concept of, you said, finding tasks, finding meaning, appreciating love in all these things. How could he cope with the fact that this all seemed to disappear in the atrocities of World War II? And the other question I would have as a follow-up is then, if he was so modern and we could still actually, or we still do apply it today, these are things that still we have not found, many of us, answers to today. And as you said, there is the problem of burnouts that he already described so many years before. Well, how was he received during his time? Was he too far ahead of his time that people didn't really appreciate what he said, or was he well received? So maybe let's start with those two questions.
Yeah, let's start with the last one because, there are two things that made me really feel humbled and almost, in doubt when reading Frankl. One is how depressing to read this and see that mankind has not has not grown out of this. It's you read his word and you would not know it's 90 years old. And it's kind of depressing to read it and see that we have not learned, have not grown, as it seems, as mankind. So that's one thing. And maybe that was like too much for many people. He foresaw it, everything. He even saw the planetary crisis. Frankl, 90 years ago, called mankind for planetary responsibility. Can you believe that? A time when the planet was not an object of discussion, was for physicists, and that's all, not in common sense. But Frankl called mankind for planetary responsibility. So yes, he was ahead of his time. Second, very frustrating to see that the message, actually a positive message, could be and maybe was received negatively because you could see, compared to what his vision was, many people were not in that state, had not that mindset. So they were so far off that it could be frustrating. And then the third point, which I found also very, very almost breathtaking, is when I was living in the US at Harvard, when I had the professorship there, everybody knew Frankl. Frankl was Man's Search for Meaning, the book that became so popular then in the US. Actually, the National Library of Congress, which is the national library in the US, lists the 10 most influential books of all times. And Frankl is among them. When I came back to Germany, Frankl, who's that? Until today, when I say Viktor Frankl, 9 out of 10 people say, who's that? I have no idea. Who's Frankl? And I was so, I couldn't believe it. He was a star. He was a superstar in the US, his books. He has never really lived there. He had guest visiting professorships, for example, at Harvard. However, he never lived there. He never had a solid academic community in the US. However, he was a star and is still today. He had a regular professorship at the University of Vienna, and people wouldn't know him in Germany. So he was ahead of his time, and somehow, it seems for the majority, his ideas were off track. And of course, they were not.
But why do you think that he's less well-known in at least the German-speaking world in Europe, or German-speaking Europe, rather? Or how did he become so well-known in the US?
Well, what I think now I have to speculate. Now I'm leaving the ground of the scientist, or my science, my personal science. You could imagine America was founded by people who wanted to start something new. And I have to correct myself. Of course, the modern America that we call America today, knowing that people lived there before that were not hurt. But let's frame it in that way, that the modern America, the modern society was founded by people who left their countries to start something new. So there was the spirit of pioneering work that was including the fact that one has to take one's fate into one's own hand, so that the responsibility is yours. Oh, how like John F. Kennedy framed it many years later, well, not so many years later, actually, in the 1960s, saying, don't ask what the country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That kind of spirit is the Frankl spirit. Because when you're in the concentration camp and everything is taken, everything you loved is gone. And he came out of the concentration camps seeing that, as you said it, his wife, his to-be-born child, his brother, his parents, all were killed. And of course he had the question, why live? Why continue living? Why? For what? And the answer then was still saying yes to life. So the idea of it's your own responsibility. It is on you. The fault is not outside. The perpetrator, the horror is true. But don't blame the outside for your personal destiny and your fate. That is so strong, and that is until today something that many people would not go with. They would say, but, yes, okay, but there is the climate, there is my employer, there's my boss who's treating me not well, there is my neighbor who is annoying, there is, there's always something, as my friend and colleague George Stefano at SUNY always says, there's always something. And this is very non-scientific, but I would say this is kind of a German mindset to always find the problems for your own suffering outside. If you are lucky, if you win, you did it. If it's your suffering, it's outside. Suffering is distinct from you. You suffer, but the reason is outside. And I think it's very unpopular in Germany, at least, or German-speaking countries, different from the US, to say, well, yes, but if you want to be happy, if you want to find meaning, it's on you, not on them.
So it's a combination both between being very individualistic in the sense that I have to take care of myself, I have to take care that I find a meaning in life, that I have a reason to get up in the morning, that I am responsible for making sure that I'm happy, but also then being responsible still in a way for the collective, because you said that he had this vision of that we have to collectively think about the planet, for example. Could you maybe explain a bit more how this, because normally it's either one or the other that is explained or followed, but somehow this seems to go together.
Absolutely. In this theater play that he put into his famous book, Synchronization in Birkenwald, it's the topic that he was actually the actual topic of his life. Between the meaning is there's no such thing as good and bad. There's no such thing as just the individual and then the collective. The synchronization meaning the potential for both sides is part of you and us. So he wanted to get out of this dichotomy of you're either a victim or a perpetrator. He was never okay, of course, with the horror. I mean, that's no question. He was never kind of making it relative to. He was never calling it by any other name than it was. There is this famous Buddhist monk, Thich Nhat Hanh, from Vietnam, Zen monk, who died just recently. He had a very famous poem called Call Me By My True Name. And this famous poem of Thich Nhat Hanh really relates to Frankl, although they didn't, refer to each other. But it's, I am the perpetrator and I'm the victim. I'm the soldier that stands in front of me and I'm the one who receives the bullet. I'm the one who is in the gas chamber opening the gas to kill the people, and I'm the one who would receive the gas. So it is this flexibility to say it is in you. Everything of that is collectively and individually, it's sitting in you. And now it's on you to make that decision and take responsibility to let that part grow, or as he calls it, to let that part transcendent from the ego to the we space, to the collective space. The collective space which is protective, which is loving, which is able to transform challenges into wins, and is able, and that was another big topic of his life, to accept us being mortal. Accepting mortality as something that we all share, and that's actually a treasure, because we produce our own past, the realization of us. So it's on us to make sure that that heritage is positive.
So if I understand you correctly, the way that Frankl could cope with the concentration camp atrocities was that he, in a way, could understand why people were behaving the way they would, and that because he had this empathy in a way, even for how people behaved, that was his way of finding understanding. I don't know, is maybe a bit too much, but more because if you don't understand a situation, you might despair, right? You think, that how can this be happening? How can people be so horrible? But if you can find empathy, then maybe this will lead to understanding, and this again would lead him to his meaning of life. Did I get this right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's maybe no other person in the world who could ever have said that, because if someone who has not gone through this would said that, you would say, well, you're in a luxury, you're in a comfort position saying that. But my life, look at my life. If you were in my shoes, you would talk different. No, it was Frankl. I mean, there's no place that could be more horrific. There's no place that could be more hell like the place he had been. Nobody in the world could tell him about horror. He's almost the only witness testifying that it is possible to not identify as a victim, as not identify as the perpetrator, and then blame your whole life the other, and being locked in the dichotomy between those two. The same with Nelson Mandela, when he left Robert Island after being a prisoner. And he was asked, how could he not punish the ones who were the waiters and the guards and everything? And he said, well, if I would punish those, if I would go in this polarity, I would keep being a prisoner for the rest of my life. I don't want to be a prisoner of that. And that's a decision one has to make. So don't identify neither as a victim or perpetrator. You have to be free to get out of this. And that is what Frankl always did.
Now, to loop back to the introduction where I started with Tolstoy, just because I find it interesting, he was in this quite privileged situation and he was despairing. He was on the brink of suicide in that text. And he was the exact opposite, right, of Frankl and also Mandela that you just described now. And maybe can we put Tolstoy in context via Frankl, because I find it quite interesting now that he was so unhappy with his life. He did not find that understanding that obviously the other two people had for this difference between people's different levels of luxury in a way. And then the other question would also be, do you have to go through horrible experiences to find a meaning in life? Are you not able to be happy if you could actually just be happy because your life is really nice?
Frankl was answering this question. His answer was very clear. He said, no, it's not necessary. You don't have to seek for trauma. He said, no. That's not what I'm saying. Don't seek trauma. It's not necessary to grow. We, in our research, we call it post-traumatic growth. So yes, there is evidence for people growing in and through trauma. But what Frankl was referring to is, don't get me wrong. It's not that I'm calling for trauma and challenges to have us grow. But he says, if it is the case, then be prepared. And you be prepared by having, not actually searching or kind of finding, but more having meaning. It's a decision. So the book is called Man's Search for Meaning, but Frankl was actually saying it's not the process of searching that I'm referring to. It's not that all have to take this learning curve, but it's a decision that you can make every day to have meaning and to start your day from that perspective. So no need to seek for trauma or even bring evil upon the world and yourself, but be prepared and have a buffer against that. And so ask yourself, what I am getting up for in the morning? What for? What is the why in my life? As Nietzsche said, and Frankl always referred to Nietzsche saying, who has a why is able to bear any how. So the how can be nice or can be really, really challenging. But that's not the point of the how, but the why. That is what you can work on. So have a why in your life. Then the how is not the most important thing.
Now, you yourself are also a medical practitioner, and you know Frankl really well, as you described in this entire talk. And I would like to know, do you use his teachings in your own practicing? Do you use it, what he said or what you read about him in your own life as well?
Yes and no. Yes, I do it because I think he has framed some things so wonderfully that you don't need to, you don't need to add anything or to frame it differently. So yes. Then I, as I said, often realize that people don't know Frankl, so it's something that is not really helpful for many at one point because who's that? So one has to explain, which I try to do. But then there is, since I'm a neuroscientist and we study the reward system in the brain and happiness, and we have a model of happiness, the biology of happiness, which is a modern, like these days, scientific model for happiness. And of course, we use different terms now. We use, we go into the brain and we look at regions and neurotransmitters. Frankl was, of course, not aware of that. So I would say I come from the modern perspective and with our 3 types of happiness and all of that. And then I would refer saying, this is exactly what the Nervenarzt, the nerve doctor Frankl, about 100 years has found. He had different tools to find it, instruments. But it's not that our model was invented by me or us. It's just sitting there as a description of reality, one could think, but it has been there before. And Frankl was one of the most inspiring people who has actually found it already and shown to us. So I would refer kind of backwards as, you could say like a father or something of that work, but then of course would frame it in modern words.
Now, time is slowly running out, and I would maybe like as a final question to ask, would you recommend that people just in their free time read Frankl's book? Is it an accessible book? And also in general, what are some take-home messages that we can take from Frankl for our daily lives, for our own happiness that we're responsible for?
Well, of course, would I recommend reading his books? There are also some recent ones who are have been edited that bring some material that has not been published earlier. So yes, dive into Frankl's work, and of course, The Man's Search for Meaning, in German, trotzdem Ja zum Leben sagen. I would recommend, if the Library of Congress says that's one among the 10 most influential books that have ever been written, so, well, who am I to not recommend it, right? So that's one. The other is, it's really fun to watch Frankl. There are some clips online if you go through your search engines and find some of those videos. He is fun to watch because he's such a cool, speaker, speaking with a very harsh German accent in English, but he doesn't care. He's so inspired by his own work. It's just fun to watch him. So that's another. And the third is, I have seen as a doctor so many people who are struggling with their daily lives with, I call it the 4th dimension of health in my work, which is, you could call it almost the sacred dimension of health between the body and the psyche as something that you can check for depression or whatever, and then the social integration, which are the 3 current dimensions of health. But there's the 4th, which I found or think very, very important, which is the question of meaning. Are you at home in your life? Are you at home? Who's there on the right and the left side and front and back from you? Who are the people you are living with? Who are your colleagues? The language you speak at your work, in your office. Do you feel at home in your life? Can you say yes to your life as it is? And is there some meaning, maybe even a greater meaning, something that inspires you, that gives you hope? So the question would be, what are you getting up for in the morning? And then the second would be, why here? Why here? And if you're not happy with the answers that you find, work on them. It's worth it.
And that takes a lot of courage. But as we have learned today, the outcome is just so valuable. So I think these were very nice ending words, your words of encouragement for us to reflect on our lives, to think about why we get up in the morning. And if we don't like getting up in the morning, to think about what would motivate us to get up. Because, well, there must be reasons out there, and be it just the nice spring day that we're experiencing today. So thank you very much for teaching us all about Frankl's thoughts, his exceptional life, and thank you for motivating us.
Yeah, it was a pleasure, and thanks for having me. Thank you.
At this point, I would also like to invite our listeners to follow further wisdom talks, as well as to curiously plunge into the multitude of texts and further podcasts that can be found on our website, www.metis.ethz.ch, the internet portal for intercultural wisdom literature and wisdom practices. If you would like to share your own wisdom thoughts on the Metis portal, we encourage you to do so. We have an open call for contributions and welcome your texts or creative contributions on any topic connected to wisdom that you would like to share with the Metis community. You can find more information about this and about today's podcast in the show notes below. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye. This Metis Wisdom Talk was produced by Martin Münnich and supported by ETH Zurich and the Udo Keller Stiftung Forum Humanum in Hamburg.